So, so today I just wanted to go over some of the basic history that led up to positional play as it is today and what positional play is. Some of you may be familiar with it. From the perspective of modern day, I would say probably the most popular guy using it is Pep Guardiola. So the style of play that you see in possession where everyone has a distinct position and they move the ball through the positions to find their way forward. And you see like a really patient, deliberate way of trying to find a way to attack and break down teams. I would say that Guardiola is probably the most successful and the most popular example that we all know today. But this presentation, my goal is to go through what positional play is, some of the details of the concept, and then sort of how it came to be from the start of our sport in 1863 to like where we are now. And hopefully there's going to be some things that you can take away and, potentially have for yourself in your own coaching and your own methodology and plan for your teams, whether it's at the younger ages, now what sort of, if you like this style of play, what you want to bring them towards as an end goal. And if you have an older team, what details you want to kind of dive into with them. Okay. So to get started, we'll just talk about some of the basics of the positional play. So the very basic is that it's an offensive concept, right? And it focuses on the ball and space on the field, right? So you need possession of the ball, and then you have to take advantage of the space on the field with the positioning of your players. So that's the basic idea behind it. The ball's used as a tool to move the opponents around to find the way forward. It's not a goal in itself. It's not the idea that you just want to have the ball and that's how you win. You need the ball to make this style of play work. So it's not we have the ball and now we're happy. We're just keeping the ball. We have 80% possession. That's not the idea. We need the ball to constantly attack opponents. So the idea is to keep your zonal responsibility, or basically, as we talk about, zonal defense, everyone has their space in the team and they move towards the ball. It's this similar idea in possession. So everyone has their zone that they attack in, a position that they attack in a structure, and it's their responsibility within that zone to move around, to create passing options, and to progress the ball forward as a team. It keeps, I'm just going to use my clicker here. So typically, when you see positional play, you're going to see a total occupation of the field, which means both wings are going to be occupied at the same time, all the way wide. You're going to see someone in the attacking position at the forward normally, and you're going to see spread out team where there's multiple positions inside of the opponent formation, but you see width on both sides constantly. So you're going to see a total occupation of the field. Every player positions in relation to what their structure is, but as the ball moves, the players adjust to where the ball is to give it the best passing options. So as I mentioned before, you're going to see players, some of them giving depth, which means making sure that they're giving options behind the opponent. They're running it behind. Some of them are going to be giving width. And then once the opponent is stretched out, because you have options on both wings, you have options in behind, then your team uses either dribbling into the middle, different players positioned in the middle to receive the ball, or runs in behind to then pull opponents apart or attract them into a certain area, and then it inevitably opens somebody else up because your team's spread across the field, and you use these different tools like a dribble, a combination play through the middle, for example. The opponent has to react, and now your winger is open, for example. And of course, the idea is to create as many connections to the ball as possible without being all condensed around the ball. You want to be spread across the field. And the number one idea of positional play over everything else, so I just described to you sort of what the structure of it is, everyone being in their positions. The number one idea is to find a free player. You want to find somebody who is now open because of the fact that we're doing positional play. Maybe it's a number 10, open between the lines because we've positioned properly and we've threatened the right things. And we've stretched the opponent out where they can receive the ball, they can turn, and now they're the free man to attack. That's the ideal goal of positional play, is to create a free player. So this is just a video, just really basic, really simple, just showing players all in their specific areas of the field, and they're moving, adjusting to the ball position, and they're keeping their position. You can see teams that we're used to, maybe in the past, less so in modern day because a lot of teams are starting to develop this sort of style of play. is like we see the left winger come all the way into the center of the field, maybe towards where the 9 is, and players just rotating all over the place, not really keeping a strict positioning, not really keeping a strict structure of their zones. That's what we're used to seeing in the past. Let your creative players be a bit more free, whether that's a Ronaldinho or whoever it was, Romario, Rivaldo at times. For example, they would be given license to go wherever they want, right? But this is a more team concept where everyone keeps their positions, and if the opponent overreacts to one area, we have players positioned where we need them to exploit them in another area. So the basic idea is to create triangles with the team, create triangles and diamonds, for example, instead of having them all in a straight line or positioned too close together, or because when you're in a straight line, you automatically kill certain passing options. So just so that it makes more sense what I'm saying, this is a simple example of 3 players. If you have 3 players, there's the ones on the left there. If they're positioned in a straight line, all of a sudden number 5 can't pass to number 3, right? Because we're all in a straight line. And then the basic idea is if we're positioned a little bit better in more of a triangle, or, if you just had a 4th player there, it would be considered a diamond. Everyone is positioned on a different line to each other. You all of a sudden see that every player has 2 passing options, whereas the other one, everyone has 1 passing option, except of course number 4 has 2 passing options each to his side. But that's just like a really simple example, I think, and a really clear way to show the value of this is why we look for triangles or diamonds in our shape rather than being in a straight line, because it just makes it more efficient and it's harder to defend, because now if there's a defender there, they have to defend 2 passing options for each player. Right. So just basically you want to create triangles and diamonds in your shape on the field, and the rest of the team interconnected with each other. And again, the little details as you get further into it, in this style of play, is obviously you start talking about the individual positional play, which is what's the surveillance, what's the sort of awareness of the players, what are they taking in information with their eyes around them, what's their body positioning, and that's influencing how good these connections are, how good these situations are. And that makes, the players then adjust based on this information, their passing angles, they know they can combine a bit faster, all these sorts of details that you can get into it individually once you add in the fact that you're starting to develop these little bit more efficient positions, okay? So a little bit more on the basics. The center of the field is typically what teams try to control. And the value of that is basically because the goal is in the center of the field. So the opponent goal is in the center. So if you can control the center and you can threaten the center, the opponent has to react to you. And in that case, they open something else. If you're positioned right, if you're spread across the field the right way, the opponent has to react to you, stop you in the middle, for example. They open up the wings for your wingers to go 1v1 or whatever it is. Okay, so typically the centers of focus of control. There is a general rule in positional play where you don't have more than 3 players horizontally or 2 on the same vertical line. And that's just to create better triangles or diamonds in the field. And you saw in that picture that we just did why the reason is there. You don't want more than 2 players vertically, because you saw in that left side, the red lines, where if there's more than 2 players vertically, there's passing lanes that aren't there now, that don't exist, that could easily exist. They're just on different lines. So that's a general rule. And then because you have a clear structure and you have these clear rules and ideas, it becomes a really clear plan for your players, and they understand typical patterns that happen in that. So if your left center back receives the ball, he'll know where the right winger is supposed to be. He'll know where the right fullback is supposed to be. And he can play a little bit more quickly and automated almost, because they all know where their structure is supposed to be. And this obviously, as I said, it results in easier understanding of the surroundings. And it makes it more difficult for the opponents to press. If your team is already in their positions and they're ready and they're spread out, it's hard for the opponent to arrive to these positions because they're so spread out from each other, to arrive with good timing, especially if these guys are already there, their body position's prepared, and they look forward and they know their options as this guy's running from far away. It's really hard to press against. So the goal is ultimately to create these different types of superiorities that I'm about to show you, that I'm about to list for you. And again, this is just showing an example of a 4-3-3 kind of spread across the field in their different zones. And it's one way to look at it, but they're all on separate lines from each other, not necessarily more than 3 in a horizontal line, not necessarily more than 2 in a vertical line. And they move the ball across these positions with little adjustments to wherever the ball is to find the way forward. The 4 types of superiority, which I just mentioned on the last slide, are going to be positional, numerical, which is going to be obviously having more players, for example, in a certain situation than others. Individual, which is obviously like having Lionel Messi on the right wing as opposed to having me on the right wing. It would be a different individual superiority. And then one last one, which is not always included, but a dynamic superiority, which is just about momentum, speed, how fast you are playing, having superiority in that. But we'll cover these a little bit later. I want to go through sort of the history of this concept and basically the ideas that come from the beginning of the game to where we are now. So it's a little bit easier to understand why this developed and where this idea is from, right? So 1863 is literally the very beginning of the game as we know it. I put in parentheses there, E.C. Morley. He was the secretary at the FA at this time, and he's the one who drew up the rules. This is literally when the game that we know split from like rugby, because there's a huge argument about should the players be able to use their hands, carry the ball, should they be able to kick each other and foul each other, which certain people thought, hey, we shouldn't use our hands and we shouldn't be able to foul. And those were the ones that ended up splitting into football, which is why it's called football. And the other ones split off into rugby, right? Because they wanted to be able to carry the ball. They wanted to be able to tackle each other and just destroy each other. So there was a split in ideas there, and they decided to split. And you can see sort of the first rules were made by the game for the game, right? Back in the day. But everyone in the country, and this is all in the United Kingdom and in England, everyone had their own, based on where you were, they started developing their own interpretation of these rules. They started thinking, okay, we want to play the game this way, right? So there's the set rules that we decided, but we want to play the game this way. Sheffield, for example, they were associated, and back in the day, there would be basically people, journalists, whoever it is, go and write down what they see, and then that would be saved, and that's what we have sort of as records, because there's no video of this, but they would be basically talked about as a team, as an area that's using scientific movements and known for their passing on game. And it's because they had a unique offside rule. And the unique offside rule was that they didn't have an offside rule. So you could literally stand next to the goal if you wanted, and you can cherry pick, as we would call on the street, by just standing next to the goal, which allowed them to pass forward, which was not really allowed yet in the rules, because if you know, in like American football, for example, you cannot toss the ball forward. You can only lateral it to the side or backwards, for example, or in rugby, you typically pass backwards. That rule was still sort of there when we talk about the really earliest forms of our sport. No one was allowed to pass forward. It was against the rules. Here, Sheffield was starting to have passes forward. There was no offside. So they're starting to like pass more than usual. 1867, FA realizes, hey, so many people have different rules to each other. We need to get together and we need to figure out what we're doing. We need to have a certain idea of putting the rules together. And in 1867, two public schools called Charterhouse and Westminster, they offered forward some rules that they thought, and FA ruled in favor of them to allow passing forward from now on. So there was no just running forward with the ball and dribbling and passing only backwards. Now you're allowed to pass forward, and there's a loose offside rule. And the offside rule back then, at this point in the later 1800s, was the fact that there must be 3 defenders between the person receiving the ball and the goal. So that was the offside rule. So as long as there's 3 defenders defending their goal, you can pass forward. Okay, so now it's allowing for a bit more passing. Now we're starting to see the game a little bit more passing. And again, in 1860s, you still heard a lot about teams like Royal Engineers, and just in general, the most popular way of playing back at this time was backing up, which is simply what I described earlier about like a football player running forward with the ball, an American football player and lateraling it, or a rugby player running with the ball and then giving it to his teammate backwards. So backing up would literally be the way the game was played early on. Was if you have the ball, you try to dribble as far forward as you can and try to score. If you're about to get tackled, you have a player backing you up, like your one teammate, and you just give him the ball right when you're about to get destroyed, and then he's able to dribble. Okay, so that was the way the game looked like in the very beginning. And then you see these developments of passing on, and now teams are trying to look at how they can pass. Just showing you the difference of obviously what this sport evolved into versus what our sport is, right? 1872, some of you may be familiar with the idea of Scotland versus England, the first ever international match. This came from Queen's Park FC, made up most of Scotland's team. And Queen's Park FC is, I believe, now an amateur or semi-pro team in Scotland. They were the first ones who were known because of their sort of, as I mentioned, everyone in different parts of the United Kingdom, they had their own separate rules. Queen's Park FC, they played with their own rules where offside was only if you're within 15 yards of the opponent goal, and there has to be 2 players between the goal and the player receiving the ball. So that allowed them to pass across the field a lot more. And they became known for a really like possession focused team. They were probably the first team that we ever saw that was recorded in history that was considered possession. They wouldn't just dribble forward or just play forward as soon as possible. They would move the ball because their rules allowed for it. And so they had their first ever game against England. And England was known as like a really big, strong team who, man, the way that they dribbled forward and they used backing up with their partner, they would go plow through players and they would score goals. They faced the Scotland team who was a lot smaller, a lot quicker, more agile, and they used ideas like double teaming. So as soon as an England player starts to dribble, 2 Scotland players would be on them. So little different idea in possession. And then out of possession, then in possession, they would use more patient passing. They wouldn't just be super direct and dribbling forward. They ended up the game 0-0, but everyone was talking about, wow, how did Scotland play? Like this style of play is totally unbelievable. And it started to spread across the United Kingdom. And one interesting thing to note is that in 1883, Cambridge University was the first team that we saw develop a system that we see a little bit more today. So you can see over 100 years ago is the first time we saw a 2-3-5, which is obviously 3 midfielders. Before this, everyone would play with like a 2-2-6 or even more forwards, 7 forwards, sometimes 8. They're the first team we saw recorded where they were playing a 2-3-5, and they had basically people were recording that they were doing zonal attacking. Like everyone had their part of the field that they were responsible for, and that's how they would attack really strictly. So you start to see little ideas. We just call it different things these days, and it's a little bit more developed, a little bit more details. But even at the very beginning, within the first 20 years of the sport, you start to see concepts like a 2-3-5, which you see Manchester City do with their fullbacks coming inside, and then they have a high and wide front 5. You start to see these ideas with zonal responsibility. And you can see here just in the highlighted, it says contemporaries described Cambridge University as being the first combination team, which means a team that actually passed the ball. They would call these teams, if you literally strung together more than 2-3 passes, you were a combination team back then, in which each player was allotted an area of the field as part of the team game. So basically what we're talking about is positional play, okay? So you can see that the style of play is starting to develop ever so slowly within the first 20 years of the game. And that Queen's Park team, that Scotland team that made waves and showed everyone what it's like to play possession football, they started to tour the United Kingdom and go to different places and spread that style of play and how the game should be played in their eyes. And Jack Reynolds, they would call him Reynolds in Netherlands. He was a British man who had moved to the Netherlands, and he became the coach of Ajax, their very first coach ever. And he was one of those people that was playing in England by the time that Queen's Park was touring around the country and showing that sort of possession style of play. He brought to Ajax a possession-oriented style of play where the team would keep the ball with shorter passes and they would attack on one wing. If it wasn't there, if the attacking opportunity wasn't there, they would switch the ball to the other wing. So you start to see the little details of Ajax popping up already. Same time this is happening, a British man named Greenwell, he goes from playing at FC Barcelona, because obviously the British were the first to sort of play the sport the way that we know it. They would start spreading out into Europe as players, as coaches. He was a player at Barcelona and he became their first ever coach. He did this style of play as well, short passing, building from the back. So just so you keep in mind, at the same time that this is happening with Ajax, Greenwell was at Barcelona. That's Greenwell there, very handsome man. And then at the same time, this is happening. Another thing to note is a man named McCall. He's from the Queen's Park team that was obviously well known all throughout the United Kingdom. He played with a man named McWilliam at Newcastle United. So just noticing that the ideas from Queen's Park, this player on the left should be popping up here. This player on the left named McCall, played with the man on the right named Mick William at Newcastle. And this is a man that later takes over Tottenham Hotspur and instills these ideas, which will be important later. Just seeing the spread from that Queen's Park team throughout Europe and throughout England. Mick William, that man who's on the right there, he coaches a man named Arthur Rowe, who coaches Vic Buckingham while teaching combination play at Tottenham Hotspur. So what you're going to see now is this man, Vic Buckingham, who was coached by Arthur Rowe, who was coached by Mick William here on the right, just giving you the sort of lineation. I know it's a lot of names. This is Mick William. He is the one who coached Vic Buckingham. Vic Buckingham basically got the ideas, just so you know, like just so you see the spread from Queen's Park, that possession-oriented style of play. It made it all the way through to Tottenham when this man was a player, Vic Buckingham, and adding a little bit of, obviously, combination play through this man teaching it at Tottenham Hotspur. So possession-oriented style of play with some combination play. He takes over Ajax after starting his career in United Kingdom after Jack Reynolds. The connection there is obviously the style of play and being British, taking over from him. He, in a preseason friendly against FC Barcelona, manages to play against them, and this is in the 60s at this point. He really impresses them with his Ajax team, with his style of play, with the passing and possession that was developed all the way from Queen's Park into what he is now. He impresses Barcelona. Barcelona think, hey, this man, he quite literally plays very similar football to what we were in the beginning with this man, Greenwell. He brought that same sort of style of play. He played against us with his Ajax team. Even though they lost 4-3, Barcelona was really impressed. And they were saying, wow, you really remind us of our first coach. We kind of lost that style of play. We would love if you come and coach us. And that established the first connection between Ajax and Barcelona. At this time in the late 60s, a certain man was developing in this academy of Ajax. And now it's getting towards the people that we understand a little bit more, that we know a little bit more. So Rinus Michels, he was a player at Ajax during this time that Vic Buckingham was there. Ajax already had the philosophy installed by Jack Reynolds, who was influenced by, obviously, Queen's Park team of Scotland. Vic Buckingham, who was influenced, obviously, through a chain of people that I showed you in the style as well, who eventually went to Ajax and then went to Barcelona because of the connection with Jack Greenwell. He now establishes a clear connection between Ajax and Barcelona, but being the man who did well with Ajax, went to Barcelona, coached there, and he coached Rinus Michels at Ajax, and Rinus Michels managed to develop in the 70s there as a coach. In the 70s, he obviously coached a man named Johan Cruyff at Ajax. He eventually moved to Barcelona as a coach, which was made a lot easier due to the fact that Vic Buckingham, who was his coach, made that same exact moves, which allowed a connection to be established between the two clubs. He coached the man, obviously, named Johan Cruyff, who developed the style further, which we're going to get into. And Johan Cruyff obviously coached and played at both Ajax and Barcelona the same way that Rinus Michels did. At the same time that Johan Cruyff was a player at Ajax and Rinus Michels was the coach at Ajax, a man named Louis van Gaal was a player, a backup, a bench player at Ajax. And he eventually went on to coach Ajax and then Barcelona and then Bayern. And a man who was coached by both Cruyff and Van Gaal that we know today is Pep Guardiola, who went on to coach FC Barcelona and then Bayern Munich as well. So it shows a little bit of this tree that connected from Queen's Park FC to Guardiola. Obviously, there's people left out, like everyone knows Marcelo Bielsa and Juan Malillo. Like these guys, there's people outside of this chain of people that are all influential. But this is the direct connections between Queen's Park of Scotland FC, of Queen's Park FC from Scotland, all the way through to connection to modern day. So just talking a little bit more about that Ajax team in the 70s, once Rinus Michels took over. So we talked about from 1863, how the game started all the way to where we are now. That brought you to now the people that we're a little bit more familiar with, and we're going to talk about total football now. So total football, what was it? Obviously, the two main guys involved in this that everyone remembers is Rinus Michels and Johan Cruyff as a player. They originally played in a 4-2-4, which at that time was inspired by the dominant Brazil team at the World Cups in this era of football. Brazil was always known for dominating World Cups and being just an amazing team, and they always played with a back four and two wingers and two strikers. So that was sort of the popular formation and system at that time. What they had a problem with their possession style of play was when they lost the ball in this 4-2-4, they had trouble controlling the midfield with only two players in there. And when they faced really defensive opponents who would all just sit back, they had a hard time attacking with this possession style, this being, slow and steady with their front six players. So what they started to develop was, okay, we need more players attacking. We need defenders to be more involved in the attack. We need more stability when we lose the ball. Okay, we need our attackers to be more involved in defense. So the forwards become the first guys to press, the defenders become the first guys to attack, right? So now we're starting to see the ideas of total football arise. And at the time, in the 70s, a very, I would say, lesser known coach, Ernst Happel, an Austrian man, was coaching at Feyenoord, which is obviously a rival of Ajax. He was doing very well. They even won a Champions League, I believe. He won a Champions League, I believe, with Hamburg and not with Feyenoord. But he was playing in a 4-3-3 formation and using high pressing. And Rinus Michels, I think, felt at this time that formation and adding pressing to the way that they're already playing in possession, with now the defenders being even more involved in the attack and the forwards having to be more involved in the defense, you start to see Ajax take over and play in a 4-3-3, high pressing when they don't have the ball, when they do have the ball, patient possession, but everyone's involved in the attack, everyone's involved in the defense. Now it becomes what we know as total football. Everyone's involved to attack, everyone's involved to defend. We press when we don't have the ball, and when we do have the ball, we're patient and we keep the ball and we move the ball, right? So now we're starting to see the basics of what we see today with Guardiola developing. And again, the team became more compact, high pressing. And this is that team that ended up winning, I believe, 2 or 3 European Cups in a row. I believe it was 2. And it might have been a total 3. I don't remember the exact numbers, but very successful team. So again, as I said, combining the pressing with what they already established from Queen's Park FC, and then developing through 100 more years of football and ideas with keeping the ball, possession, moving the ball at Ajax, combine that possession game with the pressing that they took and the new formation, and you start to see total football. Excuse me. So the idea is be proactive in every phase of the game. When you don't have it, apply pressure. When you do have it, it doesn't matter who presses you, you keep it. So as opposed to being reactive and letting the opponent keep the ball, you defend, now it's my turn to attack, now it's your turn to attack. It's always our turn to attack. We're always pressing or we're building. So the type of defense that this team was facing at this time, the very popular defense that was throughout football all the way through this period of time of the 70s, from when it started to the 70s, is man marking, right? So because man marking was the predominant way of defending, the possession game had to adjust to that. So what you saw a lot of was rotating positions. So sometimes you're 9, like if you see some video you can find online of the 70s Netherlands or the 70s Ajax, you'll sometimes see Cruyff, for example, as the 9, end up like where the right fullback is, right? So they'll rotate and they'll mess up the man markers all over the field. They'll stay stretched. They have a formation that they're going to stay wide in and stay someone giving depth, but they're going to move all around the field, okay? Because man marking then gets pulled all around. Now your center back's following the number 9 all the way to the fullback position. That's weird, right? So it opens you up and makes you disorganized. So their idea was to make the field big. When they have the ball, when they don't have the ball, make it small, which is stuff that we all coach today, right? And again, the main idea to combat man marking was ways to get rid of your marker. So rotate your position, dribble by your direct opponent, use your speed to run past your opponent and get the ball, use combination play to get free of your man, and then the simple misdirection movement, right? You fake like you're going to go this way, and then you open up for the ball and you get free, right? So all these little tools and tricks to beat man marking teams was the original way that you saw total football. So if you literally look up 1974 Netherlands versus Argentina, you're going to see the players moving everywhere. everywhere. And it's about getting rid of their markers and keeping the ball, right? So you're going to see possession football. You're going to see pressing when they lose it, but you're going to see a lot more movement than you're used to today. And this was that team. If you can find this video online of the full match, but they pressed like animals and they moved all over the field when they had the ball. Excuse me. As Cruyff became a coach in the 80s, that original Ajax team, they struggled with the ball. They lost some of their sharpness, their intensity. They often played almost in a U in the back. So the center backs would pass out wide to the fullback, down the line to the winger, and back to the other winger like that. They struggled to play into the center of teams, right? Their positioning wasn't good. They were too early forced to the side against the sidelines and pressed. Positioning inside the opponent's shape wasn't consistent, and any pass that happened inside the opponent's shape, it wasn't really followed up by combination play really well. They were lacking some detail. And as he started to coach them through the 80s, his teams began to improve. He made more players position into the middle of the opponent formation. He made them keep the ball. He made them keep their positions really strictly, with some rotation in the middle and things like that. They would play into the middle now to more players. The players in the middle had a better idea of how to combine. There would be better combination play. They would have a better idea of how to play in behind opponents. So all these things started to develop a little bit better. They knew to play into the middle first to attract opponents and then open the wings. So you saw, as you can look up these games on a website called footballia.net, like 80s Ajax, you can see their development as Cruyff became their coach. Increased position in the opponent's shape, better combination play, better passes in behind, better circulation to play into the middle. And you saw more runs out of midfield and behind. And again, around this time, he was still dealing mainly with man marking, and you see more rotation of positions in the middle to find success. So you start to see him developing that same idea that the successful Ajax team of the 70s, which he was a player on, was doing it with the Ajax team now of the 80s, and he had some relative success. And this is the team that he played with, that he coached. And there's some players in there that we can all recognize, like a Van Basten and a Rijkaard, where this was mainly a 4-3-3 with Rijkaard moving up and down in between the back line and the midfield line, which would make it a 3-diamond 3 or 3-box 3. So this is sort of the way that they played as they learned more of Cruyff's style and the more rotation of the ball. At the same time, here on the flip side of the coin, Arrigo Sacchi, and who took over after him quite quickly was Fabio Capello at AC Milan, developed more compact zonal defending, which, in contrast to what's been happening, it wasn't as much man marking. And remember, the tools that that were developed to combat the defense at that time was man marking. It developed into zonal marking, really compact, really intense. If you look at videos of Sacchi's Milan, you're going to see them all really tight together. Some of the offside traps that they pulled were absolutely insane, where the whole team sprints forward immediately. They focused on blocking the middle, being a zonal team, pressing higher. So as a team, stay tight together, push up the field, keep your zones, don't get pulled around by rotations and things like that, those tricks. Focus when you have the ball, we want to be direct. So focus on getting the ball to your striker and pressing the second ball as a zonal team. And they faced Cruyff's Barcelona in the 1994 Champions League final. And we know the way that Cruyff's Barcelona tried to play, the dream team, the sort of total football style. They were then losing some ball possession opportunities because this team was pressing in a different way and they were winning the ball more often. And they were losing opportunities to press Milan in the way that they press high intensity because Milan was just going direct to their forwards, right? So Milan, with this zonal marking and more direct style of play, was totally different for Barcelona, and Barcelona couldn't handle it. And they weren't prepared for this style of play, this more modern style of defending and attacking, where they now, okay, our possession isn't really working so well against this zonal marking team. Our pressing isn't really working because they're just going long. How do we handle this? They ended up actually struggling and losing the 1994 final 4-0, right? This was the teams that played. A lot more names that we probably all remember now. So Zubizarreta, who ended up being a director at Barcelona, Koeman, who's the coach right now, Nadal, Sergi, who's a dynamic fullback, Fer, Guardiola, who we all know, Romario, Stoichkov, Bajiristan, like all these players are much more players that we understand, that we know. And then we're already starting to see on the Milan side, Maldini, Desailly, you know, these type of players, Tassotti, right? So all these players that are a lot more famous that we are starting to remember now. So now that this style of defending has developed, Louis van Gaal came in with Ajax and had a different approach. So I'll just read this to you. He said positional switches, so that means rotations that we talked about, like the 9 ending up at the fullback and all this type of stuff. Positional switches are not the solution to outplay a compact defense. So he's saying positional rotations aren't the solution to outplay like a Milan, a zonal defense. I think that a player has to operate out of a certain position. This position is not bound to certain lines though. In this position, it is about space that has to be played through by the players. So every player should have a specific space that they play through. And the way to beat a compact defense is spread out these positions and keep these positions and play through these players. These players, he has to create the space for his teammate out of the position, but also has to close it in the right moment, right? So being stretched out, being spread out in a zonal sort of attack and knowing when's the moment to close that space, to run in behind, to get closer to the ball, all these little details. So he believes the way to break down a compact defense is to be a little bit more strict positionally, not to be switching around all the time. So we all know Van Gaal had a much more strict team-focused view. He was less about the individual creator, the Romario, Rivaldos, and all these type of players that he would eventually coach Rivaldo and get into arguments with them about him being more strict positionally. There was less room for positional rotations and less room for super complex combinations where everyone's flowing all over the field, running all around. They're very focused on spreading out, keeping the ball, playing to one wing, being stable, keeping your positions, move the ball to one wing, and switch it fast to the other wing. With a mix of some experienced players, but a lot of young talent, he faced Capello's AC Milan in 1994, which was 1 year later than they smashed Barcelona 4-0. With this young Ajax team, he won 1-0. And if you go watch the tape of this final, much more strict positionally, moving the ball from position to position to try to find the way forward. They were less exploited by the zonal defense, the zonal press, and they handled the long balls better. So Guardiola was coached by both men, and he took the best positives from each, some of the details from Cruyff and some of the details from Van Gaal for the more modern game. And again, this was the teams that you see that ended up facing each other in that 1999 final. So these are a lot more players that we now know. Costa Curta, Baresi, Maldini, part of an amazing back line. Donadoni, Albertini, Desailly, right? So all these guys that we know, and then a lot of players from the Ajax team that we know, Van der Sar, Frank de Boer, Rijkaard, Seedorf, Flipmanen, Edgar Davids, right? Overmars, so all these players that we know. So that was a run through of the history up until Guardiola started coaching. So let's get a little bit more into the detail of what each superiority is in this style of play. Positional superiority is simply the idea that you position in a way that makes you a free player and it helps you get towards the opponent goal, right? So if you have a superior position to somebody, you're not only free, but you're helping your team progress to the opponent goal. One example I would give is, let's say between the opponent midfield and defensive lines, you have a positional superiority. If you're free between those lines and your teammate passes to you, you're in a positional superiority to your opponent, who's a midfielder, because you're behind him and you're able to receive it free and attack their goal. And now you're more valuable positionally, okay? Versus you receive in front of the opponent midfield line, you're not in a more advantageous position than the opponent. You receive it, the opponent pressures you, right? So that's a little bit of a difference. The 5v3 here that you see on the bottom right corner of the presentation, that's a watermark. That's from Athletic Bilbao's methodology from Spain, known as the club that only has Basque players. And they compete with the likes of Barcelona, Atletico Madrid, Real Madrid. This 5v3 is a good example of positional superiority. And obviously you have an overload, you have a numerical superiority there, which helps obviously find a better position. But you see in this game, let's say the bottom blue player has the ball. against these three opponents, he has his two teammates support him to each side, two opponents go there, and now the two players, the one that's in the middle here and the one on the other end, they have to position on different heights and different lines horizontally to be able to give one of the players an option to be open, right? So if this guy was here, this player could mark both these options by simply marking one of them. If they're both all the way up here, he can be between them and get to both passes. So being one's a little bit higher, one's a little bit lower, one's to the left, one's to the right, you create a positional superiority where no matter what decision the opponent makes, there's someone that can be open. So a fundamental exercise is using basically a 5v3 and teaching the players, how do we all position in different spaces to create all four players that are not with the ball to be options. And that way the three players that the opponent has can't mark all four options, right? So that's like a basic tool of a positional game to teach. We have one extra player off the ball. How can we position to be more efficient? How can we create a positional superiority, right? And you use a numerical superiority to make it easier. So the idea in a big game that can help you create positional superiority is that you can occupy opponents with less of your players to help you create free men up the field. Okay, this is going to make a lot more sense when I show you a picture coming up. But an example is if you're facing a 4-4-2 and you put your two strikers higher and they pin the opponent forward back because no one can step out because the striker is going to run in behind into the space of the back four leaves. Those four players are now pinned back by two strikers, which means you've used less of your players to pin more of their players, which means closer to your goal, you have much more players to work with to create advantages to progress the ball up the field. So I'll show you a picture in a little bit. The idea is if you can pin four players with two strikers, you now have 9 players that you can play with, your goalkeeper and the other 8 outfielders, whereas the opponent can only press with 6 players, which is their 4 midfielders and their 2 strikers. And a different idea of how to overload the middle, which I'll show you in a little bit, is moving outside players into the middle. But here's the idea. If you see this picture from the 2011 final, Barcelona versus Manchester United, look at these 2 forwards, Villa and Pedro. This entire back four is occupied by these players. They cannot step out or else these guys are going to run in behind, which means United has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players that they're pressing with against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 outfielders of Barcelona, right? So they used less players pinning more of the opponent back line and Messi dropping in to create an overload to create an advantage in numbers, and they would spread out in different positions so that they can create multiple options and they would find the way forward. And if they use their goalkeeper, it would be 9 versus 6. So that's what I'm talking about here. If you use 2 strikers to occupy 4 defenders as an example, you can use front 3 if you want, whatever it is that you prefer. You can create an advantage of numbers in this part of the field where you can now progress, bring the ball to this area, and then you attack the back line, right? It's a process. And again, to overload the middle, as you see Messi doing here, Messi is originally a striker, and to overload the middle, he leaves this position up here and comes into the middle. So if you look around the middle, these are all outside players. The forwards, the 9, the wingers, the fullback, the center back, all these guys are outside of central midfield, right? Except the 3 central midfielders are always in there. You can overload the central midfield by pushing an outside player into the middle, and he can't be followed because someone's pinning him back, right? So now they've overloaded the middle because Messi can't be followed, okay? You can do this in different ways. Ways that we see nowadays, for example, is if this winger stays wide and this fullback goes into the middle. Now, if this winger follows the fullback into the middle, this winger has a 1v1 automatically, right? And teams don't want that. So they keep their shape, but now this fullback moves into the middle from outside position into the middle, unfollowed. Now you've overloaded, right? So that's what I mean when I say here, moving an outside player into the middle without the opponent following, right? So that's a tool that you can use to now have more players, create a positional superiority through your numerical superiority, progress through the opponent, and then find the way to play in behind the opponent. So the idea with positional superiority is that the players have more possibilities for actions, and the opponent can't defend all the actions, as we see now 5v3 in the bottom right-hand corner. Again, create triangles and diamonds with your superiority so that the ball can be moved to any player. And you can create these triangles or diamonds in the moment with movement, which is what we know as a third man run. So if we have a pass between two players and then a third man joins to create a triangle or to run in behind, that's called the third man who's joining, right? So in positional play, third man is used a lot in terms of whether you're creating a triangle or whether you're making that run in behind after certain passes happen between two players. Okay, so that's another aspect to think about in positional superiority. That third man is in a positional superiority. He's in a valuable position. He's a free man going towards goal most often, but he's created in the moment, sort of with momentum, with dynamic, right? So with speed, and he's not just waiting there. It happens in the moment that he moves into that third man position, and he's created positional superiority. And again, this is another way of looking at the game, which I really like this view, right? So you have the outside players, sort of the scaffolding of the team. And then you have inside players. How do you overload the middle? And then you have attacking depth. And then obviously you have an area that's too deep where the opponent goalkeeper has control of that area. You don't want to play too far behind. So again, attacking deep, attacking inside the opponent formation, attacking outside the opponent formation, and attacking in front of their formation. So that just means how we circulate the ball in front, how we attack the outsides, how we attack the inside, and how we attack behind. So again, you're giving opponents problems to solve. They have to make a decision, and then you just play the open decision, right? So you're going to put yourself in a situation where you have more options. Your players are positioned properly. The opponent's going to react by covering someone. Who's the open player now? Your players have to be able to read and find the open player, okay? So good positioning means defenders will not know who to mark who. And if you look in this 5v3 in the bottom right-hand corner, he doesn't know whether to mark the farther away player or the closer player. It doesn't matter what he decides, the player on the ball has to read the situation and find the open man. So positional play is about getting your team into a superior position, and then whatever the opponent decides, you have an answer. And again, you can still use changes in position to disorganize opponents, which we're seeing a lot more nowadays. Going into numerical superiority, which is a really simple one to understand, it's simply having more options in an area than the opponent has, right? So you have more successful options with the player on the ball than the opponent can defend. And again, this 5v3 is a clear example. You have 5 players, they have 3. You have a clear example of an advantage of numbers. And again, you saw that Barcelona picture with Messi and Iniesta and Xavi and Busquets. They have an overload in the middle, more players than the opponent has. Typically, you want to overload the zone we want to cover, which is our first line, let's say if the opponent has 2 strikers, we have 3 center backs or whatever, 3 defenders to build out of the ball with. And you want to overload the zone where we're going to lose the ball typically. So obviously the center is in a very important area to press when you lose the ball. So you typically overload the center as well. It has a defensive value. And again, this is really important to understand. How we are positioned with the ball when we have the ball defines how you can defend counterattacks, and how you defend defines how you can counterattack. So every phase of the game is interlinked. So if you're overloading the center when you have the ball, when you lose the ball, you'll have control of the center and you'll be able to kill counterattacks, which is why it's important to control the center, typically in this style of play. Often you'll see teams overload the first line of buildup with like a number 6 dropping in or a fullback staying deeper to have 3 in the back building against 2 strikers or something like that. That's one way to create numerical superiority. And obviously around the ball, you see overloads where, let's say, the left winger gets the ball, a bunch of players support him, and there's an overload in that area. If the opponent reacts, you can switch the ball. Again, you can sometimes attack with players in a certain zone to lure the opponents into that zone, which opens a different area of the field, and you attack that field because your team's spread out across the field. And this is a good example here. From Athletic Bilbao, they have a 4-plane model. So you see the 4 different planes, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So the ball is in this plane here. The forward plane is this one. The far forward plane is the opposite one, right? So what they do is they try to create an overload in the plane that's in front of them. So the zone that's in front of them, here this is the exact same situation as this 5v3 that you see as the watermark for the presentation. They have a 5v3 here. If the opponent reacts and comes over here to try to control the overload, now you have runs on the opposite side and behind that they can't mark, right? So now they have to decide, okay, do we stay over here and make sure these runs are marked, but then they can build through you on the strong side with their overload, right? So this is the advantage of having an overload let's say on one side or in the middle or anything like that. This is a picture of them doing it in game against Real Madrid. So you can see on the far side, there's players who are ready to threaten with the run in behind, but you see players on the near side where they're building 2 players on each side, a number 9 who's farther higher up the field, and a player receiving in between. Same idea as you see in this watermark here. Number 9, player in between the lines, the 6 in the fullback, and then the center back on the ball. And you see Real Madrid aren't doing a good job of marking it. They're about to play into this man who's free between the lines, who has a positional superiority, and he's going to turn and attack the back line, right? So that's how this works in their style of play. Another great obvious team, Barcelona 2010 to 2011, attacking Real Madrid in that 5-0 game. Here on this side, they have Xavi, Messi, Pedro, Alves attacking over here. Real Madrid shifts across. Xavi's looking to switch. Iniesta runs on the inside of Sergio Ramos. David Villa's running on the outside of Sergio Ramos. And again, you're threatening the near side, but you're also threatening the far side with runs. And that's the advantage of positional That's the advantage of positional play, that you're spread across the field, but also creating numerical superiorities to manipulate the opponent. So here, this actually ends up being a goal. Xavi plays it to Villa because Ramos follows Iniesta, and they go 1v1. He crosses it, and Pedro scores. This is Thierry Henry talking about how Guardiola trained positional play in the team. Basically split the field down the middle. These players have to stay over here. These players have to stay over here. Keep your positions in the team. Move the ball to find the advantages. We have certain ways that we create overloads. When the opponent reacts, we find the answer, right? And then they attack the final third a bit more free. Individual superiority, again, this is the most easiest, simplest one to understand. It's the difference between having me or Messi on the field, right? So it depends on the quality of who's on the field. It depends on who's the player on the ball, who's the player defending, who are the surrounding players. It depends on what position is that player in. So do you have an individual superiority when Messi's your fullback versus when he's your striker? You probably have an individual superiority in both, but you want to create it in a situation where it's the best for that player, right? So can you have your player who's the best on the wing, have him in that area? Your best player in between the lines, have him in that area. So everyone has their individual superiority spread out through the field, and your most talented players are getting the ball where they're supposed to. And individual superiority doesn't really rely so much on the other principles of positional play. It can be, it can be on any style of play. You can have better players and they can take advantage of their individual superiority in any style of play. But in positional play, there's a whole section dedicated to put your best players into where they're supposed to be, and it helps positional play if you have better individuals, obviously, right? Guardiola has really good players, so his positional play is able to be even better, right? And again, put the players in the positions that is best for them to succeed as often as they can possibly be. So if you have a winger who's great in 1v1s, you want to create a system where he's always the wide player in your positional play, and you're building the play through the middle. If the opponent reacts, you can get that player into 1v1 situations, for example. Dynamic superiority is the last one. And it's about speed. It's about timing. It's about how fast you play compared to the opponent. So if you have shorter distances between players, you can pass a bit quicker than the opponent can react. If you have faster players, you can literally run past opponents faster than they can react. So you have an advantage in that, which can be tied a little bit to individual superiority. Dynamic superiority also has an aspect of play against the opponent's momentum. So are you moving the ball fast enough in your back line? Are you rotating? Are you switching the ball fast enough? Is there speed in what you're doing to get the ball from one side to the other side of the field to then have an advantage over the opponent, right? So you get an advantage over the opponent simply by how fast you play, right? If you lack speed of play, then a lot of the other superiorities won't be even useful. And again, if you play fast, the opponent has less time to move and there's more space for us to play in. More good spacing helps to make the opponent arrive worse in the pressing, especially when you switch the ball. So if you're spaced out across the field and you're really well spaced, just think of Xabi Alonso when he played for Bayern Munich, for example. When he switches the ball and Robben, for example, gets the ball on the right wing and he's already waiting there, his body's positioned right way, he's looking, he's already seen everything. That is very hard to defend as a fullback who's covered into the middle to react to the players who are in the middle, and now I have to run all the way out and I'm arriving late to Robben after a switch. That's the advantage of playing fast and having good positioning, right? So just getting into the last part of the presentation, a lot more pictures here, which I'm sure you guys will like, but different zonal responsibilities. So like different coaches have different ways that they split up the field. Louis van Gaal, famously, he had his way of splitting up the fields where he made the center really wide and long, and he had the zones on the wings. He typically, in his 3-diamond-3, let's say with Ajax, he would have obviously the diamond in the middle, the number 9 in the central zone, the wingers out on the wide zones, and the back 3 obviously in the middle. And I believe he kept this sort of zonal split of the field for most of his career, because you could see a lot of times where the players were spread really far out from each other. They wouldn't really rotate positions with each other because the zones were so big and so far from each other, for example. So his was a way of playing where it was a little bit wider, bigger zones, and the players had to occupy those zones. This one's more familiar of Guardiola, which I'm sure you guys have seen, potentially somewhere online, because it's probably the most popular one that gets spread around. And Atletico Bilbao used the same one. So you have these interior corridors here, the internal zones, the central zone, the other internal zone, and then the wings, right? So instead of having the wide area in the middle, now you see it split into 3 lanes, okay? So now you see this lane for certain players, this lane for certain players, this lane for certain players, and then the wings, right? So you have your winger out here, your strikers in the central zone, your attacking midfielders are in this more interior zone, your 6 is in the central zone, your center backs are in the more interior zone, the fullbacks are in the width. And again, you've seen Guardiola where he pushes these guys into the middle, or Messi into the middle, and these guys come a bit more narrow. So you can see how, based on this grid, how the players move around, excuse me, based on what the coach wants. Red Bull Salzburg, which is a team that I visited and was able to see kind of how do they, teach their way of playing in possession. This was more in 2017, 2018 time. They use 6 vertical channels. So you have the really narrow wings where the fullbacks go up and down. You have the interior channel that's a little bit wider with the, attacking midfielders and the center backs. You have a central channel that's split into 2 lanes. So striker on each side. You have an attacking midfielder that can go to either side, a 6 that can go to either side to make sure they're in different lines. And then obviously the same thing on the other side. So simply they played with 2 strikers, so they split the middle into 2, and everyone had their zone or area that they generally tried to play in. Columbus Crew, when I worked with Greg Berhalter, we used 5 vertical strips across the field, and sometimes the middle would be dotted line where we would split the middle into 2 separate sides where, our number 9 would go to one side, and then one winger who was coming inside could be on the other side. So the way that we played back then was a 4-2-3-1. With one of the 6s dropping in and the other 6 staying up, and both wingers coming inside. So this is one winger who came up next to the striker. This is the striker. This is the other winger who came inside next to our number 10. This is one number 6 who dropped between the 2 center backs, and the other number 6 who's in the middle. And then our fullbacks went really high. So this is the way we kind of spread out the field with Greg Berhalter at Columbus Crew. Last little bit, talking about Guardiola's Barcelona, which I think are still to this day the best example of a team to ever play this way because of simply the talent level that they had. So basically, because of the level of players that they had, they could play with players in the center and spreading out further from each other because the players in the middle were so good at keeping the ball. They could spread out further from each other than other teams maybe could, right? So they could literally have Messi, Iniesta in the middle, and then everyone else spread out, right? Because if we give them the ball, they're going to collapse defenses and we're going to play people in behind. So this results in a structure that's really wide. And they most often, obviously we know that they played in a 4-3-3, but when they had the ball, they often looked like they had a box in the middle with the fullbacks both pushing up. So it looked like a 2-4-2-2, which you'll see in a picture here. So in possession, they often had Messi drop into the middle with Iniesta. So the 2 attacking midfielders, basically. Both fullbacks would push higher. So this is Maxwell, but that would be typically Abidal. This is Alves. So fullbacks higher, one center mid dropping next to their defensive midfielder. This is how they often played. So they often had this box in the middle. So this would normally be Xavi, Busquets, Iniesta, Messi in the middle. Wingers in behind. staying high and wide, pinning the opponent back line, fullbacks getting higher and wider. So this was how they sort of played in possession. They always had the numerical superiority in the middle with really, really good players, obviously. You could do the same thing with really bad players and lose every game. So it's important that you have quality to do it. The team focused on getting Messi and Iniesta the ball in the middle. In these areas here, they focused always on trying to get them the ball in between the lines so that they can dribble, collapse the opponent, and then find the open passes, right? So they would find the winger running in behind, they would find the fullback overlapping, whoever it is. And they frequently overloaded the edge of the box to break in and create crosses. So you're about to see that in this picture. So this is literally Xavi here, Messi, Alves, and Pedro. So the winger, the fullback, the attacking midfielder, and the center midfielder on that side, all attacking this side, where the idea is to try to get Messi the ball so that these two runners, Alves and Pedro, are running in behind, and we're trying to break through the sides of the box of the opponent. We're trying to break into the sides of the box so they can do those short passes where they basically walk it into the goal, the cutback crosses, or the pass across the face of goal, all these little details. So they went from basically this big structure where they're all spread out to where Messi, Pedro, Alves are attacking the edges of the box with the center midfielder giving them the ball, which you're about to see here. So center midfield giving the ball, these guys attacking the edge of the box. And when they lost the ball, they relied on really aggressive pressure out of that structure that they made in possession of the ball. So here you can see one center midfielder, the other one stepping up, both fullbacks recovering in, and the front line all pressing aggressively. So the immediate reaction of the front line to press, the fullbacks recovering into the middle, one center midfielder stepping up, the other one staying, and then the center backs are defending, obviously, the long ball. So modern times, we know of coaches like Jurgen Klopp, Diego Simeone, as they started to coach and develop even more modern defenses, which are more compact, more fast. They sprint the whole game. They sprint side to side. They're really compact. It's hard to find any spaces. It became harder to find open players in the middle as often, right? So what we started to see in Guardiola's last season with Barcelona was he started experimenting with different shapes where he could have really wide players, but have a lot of players still in the middle and even a number 9 in front. So instead of just having the players in the middle and no number 9, started to want to have front, high, and wide 3 and still overload the middle to deal with these teams that are so compact and blocking everything. We need to be able to threaten them more, right? So you start to see them play a 3-4-3, even a 3-3-4, being really offensive. And Busquets would play in a role that was similar to that Rijkaard picture I showed you of Cruyff's 80s Ajax. He would play almost like a center back without the ball, and then with the ball, he would jump into the midfield to create that 4 in midfield and spread everyone high and wide to be able to play against these teams of the modern day. And in 2015's Barcelona, you got to see Messi wasn't anymore in the middle, really. They used him and Neymar on the wings to make space now against these teams who are so compact in the middle and moving fast side to side. You need to have your best players maybe on the wings to have more space to create attacks, right? So you would see a little bit more where they were like this. So this is Enrique's Barcelona. Suarez is in the middle. Rakitic is here. Iniesta is here. This is typically Busquets, Alba, Alves, but you see Messi's really wide on the right. Neymar's really wide on the left. These compact teams of the modern day, Barcelona would still have to threaten the middle, but when you threaten the middle and against these compact teams and they're really tight together, you can immediately play it wide to Messi to dribble on the wing 1v1 or Neymar 1v1. And that's what you see a lot more in these teams today, where you see Guardiola's City where there's like a Sterling wide or a Mahrez wide versus trying to find these guys in the middle constantly to always overload the middle. So Guardiola's Barcelona, they were able to always play into the middle. But as teams evolved, it was harder to constantly play in there. You need to have the threat of the wings, right? So that's how the game's kind of developing more recently. And again, with teams improving how compact they are, how they press, how they counterattack so fast and aggressive, it's natural that positional play had to start developing and adapting to modern teams. Because obviously most teams don't have Messi and Iniesta to put in the middle and then spread everyone out. To be able to spread out positionally and attack multiple lines of the opponent, so in behind, in between the lines, in front of the opponent, against the low block, and still create combination play and things like that with speed is the hardest thing to do, right? So you want to be able to be spread out, but you still want to be able to combine and still defend counterattacks so you can play all different sorts of ways against these teams that's the hardest thing to do, and teams are trying to find different balances of doing it. So some teams have been done to focus completely on being really, really stable. Like I would say Guardiola's City is really, really stable. They rarely concede chances. Some focus on just everyone overload the middle and be very direct, very dynamic. And others try to find a little bit of a balance between them. So a stable focus that we've been starting to see is you're a bit more physical in the final third. You're more focused on crosses once you get into the final third, and you're just focused on crossing and pressing the second ball and controlling the team like that, and just going in a spin cycle, constant crossing, constant control of the counterattacks, with high presence in the box. So we see, for example, Guardiola's teams, like at Bayern, they would just cross the ball. They would move the ball a lot, obviously contact the middle, but get the ball to Robin, get the ball to Ribéry, cross the ball to Lewandowski, and just do that infinitely. Press once the second ball comes out and do that infinitely. Conte's 3-4-2-1 with Chelsea that he had when they won the league, they had Diego Costa in the middle, and they would just have fullbacks wide. They would move the ball, play it wide, crosses in when they're facing a low block. And this is a picture of Guardiola's Bayern when they faced Atletico Madrid. They were simply moving the ball quickly, circulating it, but getting presence in the box and crossing the ball into the box constantly, and just pressing as soon as the ball was lost to just have an intense, basically spin cycle to put that team in. And it was really a positional play that was a bit more focused on getting obviously stability so they're not counterattacked against Atletico Madrid, but they're having a hard time breaking down these teams who are so compact that they started just looking at different ways to break it down. They would do a lot of crosses. Balance versus imbalance. I would say in Germany, you can see a lot of teams that are focused on almost being imbalanced, where they're all going through the middle, really direct, really fast, really, really central. And out of possession, these qualities are good, right? Aggressive movement of the players towards the ball, being compact, intensity, pressing when you lose the ball. That's all really good stuff out of possession, which is why German teams tend to press really well. But in possession, it can be good for combination play and speed, but it can lack some of the value of positional play, which is to have, you know, connections to the wide areas, to be patient when you have the ball, and to not always focus on the long ball. Positional play, you need to maintain connected structure. You need to have specific patterns and movements. And one way a team has been doing it, one way a team did it, was to use positional play to advance to the box and then mix it a little bit more with the German style, with extremely fast combinations in tight spaces, to try to create through the middle and still counter press. One example was Tuchel's Dortmund, and now he had a really successful time with Chelsea. But one way he did it, he built up in a sort of 2-3-5 or a diamond with Kagawa as a number 10. So almost like 6 forward players. But the idea was build up from the back, really positional focused, really patient, spread across the field. But once you get into the final third, Kagawa, Mkhitaryan, Royce, Hoffman, sometimes Aubameyang would be here at this time. They would all be tight in the middle here, and they would move the ball from wing to wing, but they would be able to split the ball into the center and do tight, fast combination play and try to control the counterattacks that way. So that was a way that a team, we saw maybe Guardiola's example being super stable. And now we're seeing an example of how Tuchel's Dortmund was, you know, mixing stability with some combination play and intensity and speed in the final third. And then the last part being a team that maybe was focused completely on the intensity and the imbalance, which was a Red Bull, for example. They don't have a really balanced structure. Everyone's more so in the middle. They're comfortable in unbalanced situations. They're comfortable playing into the middle, really, really tight situation, and then counter pressing out of that situation. They're comfortable being like that. And they use structures which are really overloading the middle, and they play really risky vertical passes in the middle and try to control the counterattacks that way. So I think Guardiola and Tuchel, they both seek to keep balance across the entire field. Tuchel tries to mix in a little bit more of the combination play in the final third, whereas Guardiola tries to move the ball from side to side to break through the side and cross. Tuchel likes a little bit more of the combination play. And Red Bull would be an example of a team that tries to keep a structure, but is really vertical, really dynamic through the middle, a little bit more German style. And this is an example of Red Bull. You would see here 2 strikers This is the 3 midfielders. There's 6 dropped in here. This is a center back. There's 6 dropped into the back line. This is a center back. Both fullbacks high and wide, 2 strikers, 3 narrow midfielders. So while they do have width, they're not necessarily very balanced. They force, this pass actually ended up going into the striker here, which is quite crazy to think. But they play these more risky vertical passes, and they do combination play where they arrive with speed and they don't let the opponent get set in order to deal with low block defenses. So this is another way to deal with it. So again, Tuchel's Dortmund was a little bit more of a mix of a 3-4-2-1, 3-1-4-2, where they try to keep spacing, but then at the final third, try to a little bit more combination play through the middle to open things up. Antonio Conte's 3-4-2-1 was a bit more like what Guardiola was doing, where it was spread out across the field, move the ball side to side, try to create good crossing situations. And at Inter Milan, he just won the season last year, where it was a bit more of a 3-1-4-2 with Lukaku and Martinez at the top. Red Bull Salzburg under Marco Rose, who's the coach at Dortmund now, they were a lot more obviously center focused here. You see there's less balance in these zones to control counterattacks, but they focused on pressing, playing through the middle, combining, losing the ball potentially in the middle here, and pressing with all these players here, with the fullbacks recovering with speed. So they were a lot more focused on the combination and a lot of players in the center. And then Guardiola, as we know, he loves to have his fullbacks coming to the middle, his attacking midfielders high, his wingers high and wide. And it's a really spread high front 5 with the attacking midfielders obviously able to offer into the middle. Number 6 and the fullbacks coming inside almost like other center midfielders, and then move the ball side to side to try to find combinations on the wings to get into the box and pass it across. And then very last slide. What is the most recent development? So we went all the way through, we talked about what positional play is, a lot of detail, a lot of talking by me. We then talked about how did it go from 1863 all the way to like recently 2017, 2018. So what does it look like now today in 2021? The most recent development, I think, was last year's Manchester City. They were really, really good. They ended up losing in the Champions League final, but they were incredible. And I think the most innovative so far in positional play is what Guardiola did last season with the 3-2-2-3 or the 3-box-3 with Manchester City. So just as an example, what they looked like was simply one fullback would stay deeper, one would come into the middle. So they formed like a 3-2 in the first 2 lines. And then their wingers would stay high and wide, and their attacking midfielders would stay in their positions, but they would play with a false 9. So this would sometimes be Kevin De Bruyne, sometimes Bernardo Silva, sometimes Gabriel Jesus. Aguero played a little bit less. So they would play with 3 center backs, use their goalkeeper as well, which was really useful that they use him to create an advantage, even more numbers. But they used wingers high and wide to pin the opponent back line like we talked about before. But now they had 5 central players, which has been the most recent innovation, where he basically added another player centrally to just create more options in the middle than the opponent can defend. Where we saw before it was 4, right? Now it's 5. And what they would do is if this fullback needed to help the back line and drop in and create a back 4, they would still have 4 players in the middle. So they would still have a diamond or a box in the middle. If this attacking midfielder needed to drop out wide to get the ball to his feet, like let's say it's Bernardo Silva, to get the ball on his left foot and dribble inside, they would still have 4 players in the middle. If Kevin De Bruyne needed to drop out wide, get the ball on his right foot and create, they would still have 4 players in the middle. So always keeping an overload because you start with 5 players in the middle. So that was the basic, that was the development that he's made. And again, you can find an article breaking this down at this link here. And Paul, I'm sure, can share it to you guys at the end if you guys want to read this. It's a pretty long article, but it's just talking about City this last season, what they did to sort of advance positional play and to quote unquote solve how modern teams are pressing. So it was really good last year. And that's basically it. I know I just talked forever. I hope a lot of that was useful. If there's any questions, please let me know. All right, there we go. Paul, if you want to take over, I think they're tired of listening to me.
That was great, Adin. Yeah, I put in the chat that if there's any questions or comments, we've got a little bit of time here to talk and discuss it. I mean, for me, you can see why wanted to bring Adin in. I'm a big positional play coach, fan, student. I've been enjoying it since I first went to Barcelona. And I'll give like maybe a little background as an American. Growing up, never had any positional play coaching at all. I never really had a coach in my whole life tell me necessarily where to be on the field and why, just basically a general idea, right? And I can always imagine, like, all right, say, what if I was a winger in a real positional play, 1-4-3-3, playing for an Ajax, and had the ability to just kind of move intelligently in a zone and have the ball arrive to me and kind of have that idea, and it's fascinating to think about. And the more that you study positional play, the more interesting it gets, because it seems like obviously it's a big, it's a big collective team concept, right? How you structure yourself, but then also it's a really individual concept as well. Like individually, how do you position yourself to create advantages, So it's on this big team concept, and it's also on an individual concept. So, but yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, I would do a possession game and I'd run anywhere I wanted around the field to go get the ball, right? There was no positional play at all. So I was always searching for the ball. And then when you start to listen to Barcelona and you hear the interviews from the players, like Chieta and these guys that said it, my last team, I had to run to find the ball. At Barcelona, the ball found me. The ball finds you. And that's a really interesting idea, just to start with. But no, I thought that was really interesting, Adin, especially like the history of it.
Yeah.
Never gone that far back,
Yeah.
Obviously the Ajax and Renus Nichols, all that stuff, but never as far back as that. And you can see people were figuring it out. I thought it was kind of funny because one of the teams you mentioned in there was the Engineers. And you think the Engineers kind of started to figure out the space. But no, I mean, I think a lot of these coaches on here are definitely youth coaches. Let me ask a question, maybe to like Alan. Alan, I know kind of as we're starting to teach our game model to younger and younger players, we have the concepts of positional play that we're beginning to teach. Where do you start to teach these concepts of positional play to a 10-year-old, 11-year-old?
I think, it starts, I just picked up a new team, U10 right now. So it starts with the rondos, and we're introducing positional play. Right now, they look like little swarm of bees right now, that little group, because they were used to U9, UA, just running after the ball. And I think it's maybe they're younger and they're a little bit impatient because they all want the ball, and it's a little bit. But I think in terms of just positional games, and right now I'm trying to figure out. I have 12 players, and I thought, oh man, 12 players, perfect numbers for U10, but they're U10, So I have to have 2 positional games going, and it's basically like a 2v2+2. So it's a 4v2 rondo. But in terms of that, I'm barely kind of like understanding of trying to work with them, of teaching them to not just run after the ball, or because one player has the ball, our target player, for example, and all 3 players just get closer to the ball, and because they get closer because they all want the ball, not because but they're struggling to understand, I think, the concept of obviously the spacing, and hey, for example, if the target player is free, he doesn't need to have, he's free because he's not being pressured, he has space in front of him, he can dribble, and he doesn't need teammates supporting him or getting closer to him, because all they're doing is just bring more defenders with them. So I think that's kind of what I've been going through, I think, with those players kind of right now. With the U10s, with the U12s, it's a little bit different. They have a little bit of an understanding, but it's trying to go, I think, dive deeper into with them, with those players right now. So that's kind of where I think in positional games and rondos, that's kind of been all I've been doing for the past, 10, I've had 10 sessions with them, and that's all I've been doing with them. Positional play, rondos, and then just playing at the end and rewarding points. If we find, like a combination, if we find a free player that's facing forward, I give them extra points for that. So I think it's trying them to get, but they're, like I said, a little bit, they don't understand the concept of patiently waiting for the ball, like you're talking about. No one ever taught them to hey, just wait for the ball, because the ball will get to you eventually after maybe 3 passes, but they all want the ball right now. So that's kind of what it's a little bit of process with those U10s. With the U12s, it's a little bit easier because they have the foundation set with them. But the U10s, that's kind of what I'm kind of going through right now. But mainly rondos and positional play, 2v2+2. But even two games going, you still have to be watching the whole time, and it's difficult to have 2 games there. I thought it would be easy day to have 12 players, but a U10 it's a little bit difficult. That's kind of what I'm kind of going through right now with those boys.
Thanks, Alan. Adin, a really good question from Aaron. Interesting question. Can you speak a bit about whether the concept of phase of play is an important part of positional play or not? Meaning, in your experience of teaching positional play, include phasic progression such as build up, possession, attack, and finishing. And then does it inhibit the expression of positional play? I would love a shot at that one after you, but
yeah. So the way I've always looked at sort of separating it out and teaching it is, I do look at it as like a build up, like a build from the goalkeeper, or what we call it Houston, like a CPA, and then into what I would look at, like how we possess in midfield, and then looking at how we finish the attack, or finish the attack, or like the final third. So like the different thirds, I like looking at it as sort of what part of the field you're on. But I think there's also a way you could look at it as, without inhibiting anything, I think you can look at it as when you're building from in front of the opponent block. So whether that's involving the goalkeeper or not, when you're playing into the opponent's shape to find a free man facing forward, which would then start what we call at Houston like a destabilizing, where now you're finishing you're starting to find that free player and you're trying to create the last part of the attack, and then finishing the attack, which is to play in behind the opponent or cross the ball or some things like that. So I think it doesn't inhibit positional play if you look at it that way. And that's the way I've sort of looked at it, those sort of ways, like what part of the field are we doing it on and how does that change things? Whether we're finishing, whether we're in the middle, whether we're starting with our goalkeeper, and what part of the buildup are we in? Are we in front of the opponent? Are we in between their lines? Are we now playing in behind them? So I think it's a useful way to sort of separate it out in your mind. But yeah, obviously you have to be careful with separating things out and making sure that, if you call the first phase, for example, build up with the goalkeeper, right? And you have a certain way that you play with build up with the goalkeeper, and that you consider that to be the only in the first part of the field where your box is, and then you're in midfield all of a sudden and your team is in front of the opponent block and they're doing build up, but it's considered build up, but it's not build up with the goalkeeper. And all the names get mixed up. Like you're still, and as part of the possession where you're trying to play into the opponent's shape. So you haven't really gotten past build up yet. And the part of the field changes. So that's where it can get a little bit confusing when you name things like this is the way we play when we're in this part of the field, but all of a sudden the opponent behaves similar to like a goal kick, but lower on their field. Then you have to be a little bit more clear, I think, on like the way we do it is you have a CPA, you have a destabilizing, and you have a finishing, which all is relative to like, how do we build up in front of the opponent? How do we find that player inside the opponent to destabilize them? And then how do we finish the attack? And I think that can apply to like wherever the opponent is on the field, right? So just being careful about how we name things, but I think it's a good idea to separate again. I hope that made sense. If it didn't, you can obviously ask me again to clarify. But go ahead, Paul, what do you think?
I was gonna say I think it's good to provide the idea of phases, because I think it breaks the game down even more. So like we say collective possession to advance, and we have the 3 phases. I'm sure Aaron, you guys probably have maybe phases as well, but Franz Hoek actually, who he actually divided the phases into four phases up the field, right? So he distinguished the CPA between the buildup and also the buildup with the goalkeeper. So I think it's good to understand that, because ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is find these preferred tactical situations. These tactical situations, we're trying to find the player in between the lines who's facing forward. That's what we're trying to do. So if that's what we're trying to do, and we work backwards from that, right? You're getting to this phase, this whole idea is to get it to that player. And you can do that through your principles, right? The creation and use of space, playing in between the lines, in the gaps. You can do it through teaching good individual positional play, like how do you play off a player's shoulder? How do you orientate your body to see? How do you look? So you're creating these little advantages in this buildup where you should have numerical advantage. And then once you find that free player that's facing in between, there needs to be these ideas in the players that's the moment. We are now going into a different phase of play. And so I think it's advantageous to the players, you know. I think you do have to be a little bit more disciplined, you know, as a preference for me, you have to be a little bit more difference in the CPA than in destabilizing.
Mhm.
Just the whole nature of it, you know, because you do have numerical advantage. And if you are positioned well, you should be able to find those players in between lines. So, and then when you get into these destabilizing phases, you may not have the numerical advantages like you have before. So, I think you can get really, there's a lot of freedom in positional play, but I think it also starts with good discipline.
I see a question from Ben. He says, do you feel there's a move back to the old school number 9, Lukaku, Kane, Calvert-Lewin? And then he mentioned imbalancing, you see with Shakhtar. Yeah, Shakhtar's a good team.
Shakhtar is good.
Yeah, but old school number 9, like, I don't know if there's necessarily like an explicit move where everyone's deciding that they want to move back to that, but I think an old school number 9 who can be a big physical presence but still play with your team and link up like Lukaku and Kane and these guys do, like those players are always going to be valuable. And I think we're just seeing more of them in the Premier League now come to sort of fruition, and now we're seeing them much more. I don't think it was something that everyone decided like we need to move back to the old school number 9. So I just think really good 9s became available and they took them, and like any coach in the world would want like a Kane or a Lukaku, right? So it doesn't matter if you're a positional play coach or whoever, right? In any generation, a number 9 who can hold the ball and who can attack crosses and who can do all these things, like that's the ideal, right? So I think not necessarily a move that everyone's decided on. I just think these guys are coming up in the game right now, and there's quite a few more of them now, and we're seeing them a little bit more than maybe in the last 5-10 years. Does anyone else have any questions or anything like that, Paul?
Hey, Dean. I had a question. First off, thanks, Paul and Adin for taking the time to present today. You know, I think, you know, kind of going back to working with young players, you know, I think, and I see it with, you know, U10. I work in the foundation U10, U11, and U12. You know, I think a big habit they have, young players, is whenever they receive the ball, well, first off, for bad orientation, receiving, and they're facing their own goal, is turn and go. And a lot of they've been taught, hey, turn and go because they're fast or whatever it may be. But I guess, you know, teaching the concept then obviously of a third man, you know, understanding that hey, you're just a link player. How have you guys been able to maybe teach young players that concept of because it's about, you know, having the player understand that he's a link player. He just needs to help the third man receive the ball because he is facing forward. And I think, you know, how have you guys, I guess, introduced it and maybe taught players to understand that? Because, you know, I think the third man, you know, Guardiola and they've always talked about it. And that's the thing it's like given in every, I think, you know, Guardiola, it's like a given. Within 2 weeks, you can already see it, you know, implement. So I guess, how have you guys seen, or have you guys, you know, introduced it and talked about it, maybe, you know, taught young players, I think, that concept of, you know, first off, finding the third man and then recognizing, hey, I am the free player. I have to move into this space, and the timing of, you know, kind of all that.
Yeah. For me, I think that's obviously like a third man is like a more difficult, right, concept, especially for younger players. So that's one where it's like, that's a lot of time to focus on teaching them, you know, how to use your third player, because they think, first of all, the youngest players think about themselves, and then when they get a little bit older, they think me and maybe this teammate, but then thinking about me, this teammate, and this other guy as well, right? So like that's the next level. And I see Everick even put it in the chat here about starting with decision-making games like 2v1, 3v2. I think it's literally a combination of things that, like, as coaches, we have certain tools. I think, especially with the younger players, it has to be a little bit simplified, but you can talk to them, like literally show them picture-wise, like visually, whatever it is, like a board or a video or something like that. Then you can talk to them about it. Like, this is what we're looking for and this is the value of it. Put them in unopposed games potentially, just to get the idea in their head of like, this is what it means to lay it off to a third man or something like that. And then I think the most valuable is like what Everick said. For me, I think it's making it into a game, a small game where the rules, the constraints of the game, give them rewards or restrict them. Originally, you can do it where they're restricted to finding the third man. They have to find always the third man and they start to understand the value of it. But then you can take the restrictions away and you can give them rewards for if you find a third man combination before scoring. And then the concept you start to see once you hit them with, you know, the visual way that you're teaching them, the talking to them, the maybe giving them a little bit more of an unopposed just so they understand the idea, they go through the motions, and then giving them the games, I think is like the way I would try to teach absolutely anything, not even just third man, but anything. Understanding obviously their level and how you want to give it to them, right? They're not going to be understanding super complex language or anything like that, but that's the way I would do it. But yeah, like functional rondos, for example, as Ben said, yeah, like basically exactly what I was saying, you know, get them maybe a potential more unopposed exercise into more small, simple game, and then all those different layers onto the teaching. Paul, do you have anything to say about that?
I think you mentioned language. I think language is really, really key. You know, like for me, the methods are just like a positional game. Alan, are just, that's just the platform for all the teaching. And I think you start to, you know, develop a appreciation through language. So I think early, even for a U10 player, you know, U11, you know, you start with maybe a value of the ball, right? Like, we want to dominate this ball, right? We want to value this ball. And that's our way of playing. That's how we play. And then you start to begin to teach them the value of their positioning, right? On an individual level, like the 2v1 proper on the width. That's kind of a first general insight of positional play, right? Like if I go too high, if I go too low, I'm not creating a tactical advantage. Even a 10-year-old can do that. Or, you know, a lot of young players, because they just stare at the ball, they just run, right? So they're just running and they're not positioning. So getting that player to play in the epicenter or in between the lines as a first teaching, and you can do that in a positional game. You can do it in the positional game like the you know 2v2+3 where the channels are in different channels, right? And you could freeze the game and show how they can be in different vertical channels, right? You can walk them through what a link action is, right? Where it's, I'm trying to get to him, but it's going to come through you. You've linked us, right? And I think that earlier, in fact, that's what we want in Catalyst, right? In Catalyst, we want to have this early start on these positional play ideas, you know, at 9, 10, 11, so that when they come to us at 13, they've got some good concepts, right? So, yeah, I mean, right now we're doing a lot as far as our language, our terminology, you know, our cues, all that kind of stuff. And then start to teach it, be consistent.
Thank you guys, appreciate it.
Love the direction this is going. How does Houston go about helping the players reduce the noise? What do you mean by that, Ben? Can you explain that a little bit?
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
So I've been reading a lot of Dynamo, and he talks a lot about reducing noise. So I think you're kind of getting into the direction with the language and your terminology. So yeah, when a player gets on the ball, they look ahead and they've got 5 people in front of them, and this is happening, and that is happening. How do we help them reduce the noise around them to know, okay, you know, is it your phase of play, like you said, the language?
I think you know, kind of going back to what Everick was saying, is you have to simplify the game down. from the big numbers to the smaller numbers. You have to somehow show the players the 2v1, right? You have to somehow show the players the 3 versus 2. You have to somehow show the players, you know, how they work in close positional relations with, you know, the right center back, the right back, the 6, the 8, how those 4 together, you know, can create structures and have ideas, because it goes from an individual sense. Because when you first start playing soccer and they're chasing the ball around, a player could still have good positional instinct, meaning there might be one player that kind of drifts away and goes, man, if I come here, the ball pops out, I'm good. That's an intelligence, right? Or that's an instinct. That's a positional instinct, right? But not every player has that positional instinct. Not every player instinctually knows how to create an advantage with the position. So it has to be taught, right? And I think also in America, because we are in such a rush to go forward, we don't have the time to gain a position, right? Because we're in constant transition. And when you're in constant transition, you can't gain positional structures. You can't go to these concepts of positional play when you're constantly in transition. Positional play is basically a way to fight against transition, right? You're fighting against transition, and then you're also at the same time embracing transition, embracing the transitional moment, I should say, that moment of transition, because your structures are make such sense that they go. But anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. But I think going, you know, showing smaller groups of players how they've, hey man, if you position here, it's a little bit better than maybe if you do here. Or what do you think about that position? Or why are you positioned there? And what about your orientation? Because it even goes back further, goes levels back further, like Alan was saying. Most players only stare at the ball. And because they only stare at the ball, they have no other references from which to position. Because if I'm only staring at the ball, I don't know where the defender is. I don't know where my teammates are. I don't know where the space is. So getting players to not stare at the ball and to look around the field, watch the game rather than watch the ball, is probably the very, very, very first step. Because they're probably smarter than we give them credit for. If they look around, maybe they, you know, you can see a really good, like, watching youth games is really interesting because you can watch, and if you're watching really, really closely from a positional sense, you can see players that sometimes they go and they stop or they move back. And that's the positional, I mean, something's registering, right? They're not chasing the ball. That's pretty interesting, right? So I think maybe as a first step, it's getting players to stop staring at the ball.
Yeah, I like what you said, that when you're in constant transition, you can't get in position. I like that.
Yeah, that's something that right now with my 17s, like we scrimmaged the U23s the other day, and I guess facing a bit older players and things like that, but just in general, the team, they tend to go forward a little bit too quickly, to put it lightly, right? So they lose control of the game. There needs to be a bit more keeping of the ball, getting into your positioning, making the game a positional game, and now you're trying to find the solution to go forward. Versus obviously the older team, they're bigger, they're stronger, they come in high press, so it becomes really hard to keep your cool and to figure out how to play, right? But they have trouble with that, and that's something that we are literally working on right now as a U17 team, to actually value the ball more, to go through positional play actually, right? And obviously stuff on the other side of the ball, making sure we're pressing properly. But right now in possession, especially when we face an older team, we tend to rush a little bit or lose our cool and not deal with it, right? So that's something that I think like every team deals with in the beginning, right? So it's even something that we're dealing with right now.
Adin, thank you, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. Really
I hope
cool.
I didn't make anyone go to sleep.
No, man, that's great. All right, well, we've gone over our time, Adin. We don't normally do that, so it must have been pretty darn good.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good sign, I guess.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Thanks everybody for joining in. Much appreciated.
Thank you
All right.
guys. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Adin.
Got it. See you guys later.
Thanks, guys.